They say dignity begins with how the world sees you. But for Evan Miles, dignity was something he carried alone, stitched onto the olive hoodie he wore that cold morning, in the form of a tiny rainbow pin. No one else seemed to notice, but maybe they did and chose to look away. The boy walked alone. Skinny frame weighed not by luggage, but by the silence of a funeral. He was 14, white-skinned, with long brown hair brushing his jawline and gray-blue eyes so clear they looked like untouched sky. His fingers clutched a first-class ticket. He arrived early at Gate 21, cradling the small ticket envelope like it held his last tether to someone who mattered. He was on his way to attend the memorial service of his foster mother, an activist known for fighting systems built to crush the unseen. And though she was gone, another figure had stepped in near the end, Thomas Miles, her closest friend, and the boy's legal godfather. Before Thomas passed from a sudden stroke, he left behind a gift, a seat in first class, not for luxury, but as his final gesture of care. Evan waited near the gate, his backpack tucked tightly against his chest. His name was on the boarding list. His seat had been confirmed. But dignity isn't always recognized by uniforms. Sandra Pierce, the chief flight attendant for that morning's flight, was efficient, sharp-voiced, and always watching. Her eyes scanned the boarding crowd like a radar looking for threats or anomalies. When she saw Evan, she paused. Something about him, the soft features, the pin, the posture that leaned inward seemed to trigger something unsaid, and then she acted. Without asking questions, she walked straight up to the boy, no lowered tone, no concern, just a hand that reached out, took the boarding pass from Evan's hand, and tore it in half. "You must have stolen this," she said loudly, "or someone made a mistake. We don't assign first class to people like you." The words struck louder than the rip of paper. Gate 21 fell into an uneasy hush. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A man in business attire blinked, lips parted to speak, then shut them again. Someone further back raised a phone, recording. But no one stepped forward. Evan didn't cry. He didn't plead. He only blinked once, lips barely parting as if breath itself had to be rationed. Then he bent down slowly, picked up the torn halves of his ticket, and stepped aside. There was no apology, no explanation. Sandra had already turned away, directing others onto the plane, her tone back to chipper professionalism. And so the boy made his way past her, holding what remained of his seat with trembling fingers. Row 38. B was the last row on the plane. He slid into it like someone slipping behind a curtain, hoping not to disturb. The backpack rested on his lap. It was old, faded, and stitched with patches. He opened it with careful hands, pulling out a battered laptop. Not the sleek kind used for games or school projects. This one was used for things that mattered. He logged in through the airline's Wi-Fi, bypassed several encryption layers, and opened a folder labeled Ethic Protocol, Final Draft. There were files, documents, charts, internal emails, all tied to the FAA and its upcoming reform proposal. The name Thomas Miles was on nearly every email. And now, by an unusual clause in FAA regulations, all of it belonged to Evan. Thomas had chosen him not just as a foster child or a godson, but as the heir to his digital legacy. As per FAA Rule 491.6b, high-ranking ethics consultants were allowed to designate a civilian successor to their data if death occurred during active drafting of a regulatory document, a successor they trusted with their conscience. Evan typed a short email attaching the files. He didn't write a complaint. He didn't demand retribution. He simply placed the truth where it belonged. The subject line read, "Dignity is not a privilege." He clicked send. At 38,000 feet, no one turned around to look at him. No one offered him a drink or asked if he was okay. And that was fine. Evan wasn't waiting for kindness. He had inherited something else entirely. The cold air that had greeted him at the gate seemed to follow him into the sky. But this time, he didn't flinch. Because what had been taken from him, respect, safety, a first-class seat would soon be measured in a different currency. Not one of luxury, but of legacy. If this story speaks to something inside you, you're not alone. Follow Heart Story for more tales that dare to say what others won't, because the quietest stories often carry the loudest truths. The seat creaked beneath Evan as he settled into 38B. The vinyl was cracked, the tray table stained, his legs barely fit. Wedged between a metal bar in the back of the seat ahead, a toddler cried 2 rows up. The air smelled of reheated meals and recirculated tension. But Evan didn't complain. He hadn't spoken a word since the gate. He placed the torn boarding pass in the seat pocket in front of him, both halves pressed together as if the paper might mend itself. Then he reached for his backpack, unzipped it slowly, and pulled out a weathered laptop. The hinge squeaked, but the screen lit up. He typed a passcode with practiced care, then connected to the airline's network. Inside his desktop was a single folder. It didn't stand out at first glance, but its name was unmistakable: Ethic Protocol Final Draft. The folder held more than just drafts and templates. It contained a full archive, tens of pages, encrypted files, and dozens of internal FAA emails, some dated back months. All of them bore the digital signature of Thomas Miles. Evan's fingers hovered over a message chain titled Whistle Clause Revision. He knew what it was. He had helped format the language just 3 weeks ago, sitting beside Thomas in the sunroom, adjusting margins while Thomas dictated policy language. Back then, he hadn't known it would be the last time. The final message from Thomas had arrived just hours before the stroke. If anything happens to me, don't send this to just anyone. Wait until the moment feels like it matters. Evan knew that moment had arrived not because of what happened to him at the gate, but because of what would keep happening if no one acted. Among the attachments was a time-stamped video, clipped from a phone camera. Sandra Pierce, standing at Gate 21, voice sharp, hand tearing the ticket. Her words echoed in the footage like a verdict: "People like you don't belong in first class." He attached it to an email. No commentary, no footnotes. Just the truth. Standing alone. To ethics.committee@faa.gov. Subject: dignity is not a privilege. Attachments: ethic protocol. Final draft. Gate_21_incident footage. MP4. He hit send. The laptop's fan whirred. The plane rumbled. Evan leaned back, staring at the seat in front of him. Across the aisle, a woman glanced at him, then looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. He noticed the hesitation, not anger, not judgment, just discomfort. The kind people wear when they know something is wrong but pretend otherwise. Evan wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger would mean giving someone else the power to define how he should feel. Instead, he felt still, like the way a lake holds a storm below the surface. He reached into the backpack again. Inside was a note, folded 3 times, the ink fading. It was written by Thomas Dignity. Evan, isn't about being important. It's about being equal. If you're ever in a place where someone tries to strip that from you, stand. Quietly, if you must, but stand. The weight of those words settled differently now. He hadn't expected to use them this soon. He hadn't expected to be the one left behind to act. The hum of the plane filled the silence. In the front cabin, drinks were served. In the back, a tray rattled past without stopping. Evan didn't mind. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness settle. Somewhere at cruising altitude, a truth had been released, not just in an email, but into the air itself. It was no longer just about him or Sandra or a seat that had been denied. It was about a system that quietly agreed with what she'd done, a system that had gone unchallenged for too long. But now someone had drawn a line, not with noise, not with protest signs or viral videos, at least not yet. Just a digital signature, a file shared, a boy in row 38B, with a quiet grief and a small rainbow pin. In a world where appearances so often determined worth, Evan carried something different. Not defiance, not pride, just truth anchored by grief, propelled by responsibility. What lives in a backpack can sometimes weigh more than a suitcase. And sometimes, what a child carries isn't just books or clothes, but the broken spine of a system waiting to be rewritten. In that stillness, Evan understood something Thomas had tried to teach him all along, that the quietest acts of courage aren't the ones that shout, they're the ones that refuse to disappear. At 38,000 feet, silence ruled row 38B, but below, the internet was erupting. The email Evan had sent reached the ethics committee's inbox just as a junior assistant, halfway through her shift and halfway through a sandwich, opened it. She didn't recognize the sender's name, but the subject line stood out like a wound. And when she clicked the attachment labeled gate_21_incident footage, MP4. The bite of her sandwich stalled midair. Within minutes, someone else had already posted the video. Not Evan, not the committee, a bystander. The one who had raised their phone but said nothing at the gate had uploaded the clip to X. The caption was short, sharp. "This is how airlines treat gay kids. #Evan38B #rainbow in the back." It was all it needed. The hashtags lit up faster than takeoff. Within the hour, the video was trending globally. Comments poured in anger, disbelief, sorrow, rage. Some praised Evan's composure. Others condemned the silence of the onlookers. A few recognized Sandra Pierce. Someone even dug up her LinkedIn. The dominoes had started to fall. Inside his inbox, Evan received a new message. Not from the FAA, but from a private account. No signature, just a line of text. "I was a student of Thomas Miles. Thank you for doing what many adults wouldn't dare." The message didn't ask for a reply. It didn't need one. Someone out there understood what had been done and what was coming. By midday, journalists began calling. Not to Evan directly, he had no public presence, but to anyone ever associated with Thomas Miles. They reached out to former colleagues, academic circles, policy think tanks. One reporter noticed Evan's name listed under a photo taken the year before, a gala honoring the Dignity Act, a landmark piece of legislation co-drafted by Thomas. In the image, Thomas stood beside a boy with soft features and a rainbow pin on his blazer. The connection was made. News segments soon followed. Teen discriminated on flight may be successor to late FAA advisor. Whistleblower footage ignites national conversation. And then, most damning of all, FAA ethics draft possibly leaked by minor following airline incident. It wasn't just a trending moment. It was a storm. The airline's headquarters scrambled to respond. At first, they issued a vague statement about reviewing protocol and ensuring inclusive values. But the backlash was swift and brutal. Comment sections exploded. Former passengers came forward, sharing past experiences. Advocacy groups began demanding transparency and reform. Faced with mounting pressure, the CEO took drastic measures. The flight crew involved, including Sandra, was placed on temporary suspension. The airline's public relations team requested an emergency meeting with the Department of Transportation. Meanwhile, a formal request for hearing was delivered to the Congressional Transportation Oversight Committee. This wasn't about a single seat anymore. It was about a pattern, a structure. Evan remained silent. He hadn't posted a single word. He didn't reply to messages. He didn't watch the news. He didn't need to. The system was reacting exactly as Thomas had once described it, not because of a shout, but because of a tremor at the foundation. In the late evening, the boy finally checked his email again. Among dozens of unread messages, one stood out. It came from a policy researcher who had worked with Thomas. The subject line simply read, "He would be proud." The message inside had no politics, no technical language, just the acknowledgement that somewhere in the center of all this noise, a boy with nothing but a backpack, a pin, and a name had managed to shake an entire institution. Evan closed his laptop and sat back, watching the small television screen flicker across the aisle. An in-flight documentary showed images of planes through history, how air travel connected people, lifted lives, crossed oceans, but no image spoke of who it left behind. There is a power in stillness, in refusing to vanish. And there's a lesson, too, that systems change not only when laws are broken, but when truth becomes undeniable, when silence is interrupted not by force, but by quiet resistance, not by anger, but by something more enduring, integrity, and the courage to protect it, even from the farthest seat in the sky. When the wheels touched the runway, the cabin erupted in the usual shuffle. Seatbelts clicked, overhead bins opened, voices rose with the impatience of landing. But on this flight, something was different. No one was allowed to leave. A quiet announcement came from the cockpit. "Please remain seated. Ground operations will begin shortly. Thank you for your patience." But the tone was too firm, too rehearsed, and passengers sensed it. Whispers started. Phones were unlocked. Heads turned toward the front of the plane. Evan remained still in 38B. He had heard the announcement like everyone else, but he knew why they weren't disembarking. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't weather. It was him. Outside the aircraft, a line had formed on the tarmac. Security personnel, airport officials, members of the press, and, Standing slightly apart, a representative from the Federal Aviation Administration. Evan recognized her immediately, a woman with silver hair and a navy blue briefcase. Anna Whitlock. She was a civil rights attorney who had co-authored the first version of the Dignity Act alongside Thomas Miles. Years ago, Evan had seen her picture framed on the wall of Thomas's home office. She had once fought corporate negligence in courtrooms no one dared enter. Now she stood there, waiting for him. But it wasn't just her presence that unsettled the crew. Minutes before landing, a senior FAA investigator had served an internal alert. The lead flight attendant, Sandra Pierce, was officially under review, not just for the incident with Evan, but for a past that was no longer buried. 6 years earlier, Sandra had been involved in a high-profile incident in Atlanta. A black woman with priority boarding was removed from her seat after a dispute with staff. The case had gained traction briefly, but was soon silenced. Quiet settlements, sealed testimonies, internal favors, and it had vanished. Until now, one of the passengers on Evan's flight, after recognizing Sandra from the viral video, had started connecting dots. She live-streamed from her seat, reciting the old headlines, overlaying them with today's footage. The internet took over from there. Old records, old stories, names that had been forgotten brought back into daylight. The cabin lights flickered. The intercom clicked on again. This time it was a different voice. "We will now begin disembarkation through the rear of the aircraft. Passengers are to remain seated unless called." This wasn't routine. A crew member appeared beside Evan's row, clipboard in hand. Her face didn't hold contempt. It didn't hold pity. Just clarity. "Mr. Miles, you'll be escorted off by your guardian." Evan nodded. He rose without a word, collecting his bag and the folded note from Thomas he had kept in his pocket. As he stepped into the aisle, a few passengers looked away, but more of them looked directly at him. One elderly man gave a small nod. A flight attendant cleared her throat and stepped aside. Then the emergency exit at the rear opened, and Evan stepped into the light. Anna Whitlock was already there. She held out her hand not to shake, but to offer something. A manila folder, thick and sealed. "Your name is on this now," she said, softly. "And not just because of Thomas." Cameras flashed in the distance, though security kept them at bay. Reporters called out questions, most of them unanswered. But one voice rose above the others. "Why didn't you fight back at the gate?" Evan stopped walking. He turned to the line of journalists, his face calm, his hands steady. Then he spoke his first public words since the flight began. "I wasn't hurt because I'm gay. I've lived with that. I was hurt because everyone watched it happen and said nothing." Then he turned back toward the terminal, walking beside Anna. Somewhere inside that folder was the documentation that would cement the ethic protocol into motion. The draft, the footage, the co-authorship, but none of it carried the weight that Evan's presence did, not just as a witness, not even as a victim, but as someone who, against every pressure to disappear, had remained visible. He hadn't demanded the system collapse. He had simply revealed the rot and let the truth speak louder than vengeance. It is easy to punish people like Sandra. The harder thing is to admit who protected them. And the lesson wasn't just in what Evan endured, it was in what everyone else allowed. Because silence, too, is a kind of decision. And when enough people decide to say nothing, dignity becomes optional, but not today. Not anymore. Weeks passed. The headlines faded, as they always do. New scandals replaced old ones. Algorithms chased newer outrage, but somewhere deeper in policy rooms, in internal memos, in federal archives, something stayed. Evan Miles had not asked for a monument. He had not spoken on morning shows or signed book deals. He declined interviews, ignored requests to share his side, because what mattered had already happened. 30 days after that flight, the FAA held a closed-door press briefing to announce a new passenger regulation. It would apply across all domestic carriers and international partners entering U.S. airspace. It was designed specifically to protect travelers under 18, those traveling alone, those visibly different, those previously overlooked. It was called the EM Protocol. The letters stood for Evan Miles. A reporter covering transportation law found the document online buried deep in the FAA's transparency database. She printed all 84 pages, flipped through them quickly. One page stopped her, a dedication. in memory of Thomas Miles, architect of equity and reform. Beneath it, in smaller print, co-author posthumously ratified Evan Miles, 38B, no fanfare, no spotlight, just proof that legacy can be handwritten, sometimes from the back of the plane. At Denver International Airport, subtle changes began to appear. First, it was the booking screens. Seat 38B on every flight that passed through the terminal was marked in gray, not available for selection, honorary placement reserved. Then came the signage. In Terminal A, above Gate 21, a digital display lit up with a quiet message rotating among weather updates and departure times. If you wear a rainbow, we'll fly you with pride, not shame. Evan saw it once, not in person, but in a forwarded photo from Anna Whitlock. No caption, just the image. He didn't reply. He only saved it. He had returned to school quietly, resumed coursework remotely. A few classmates had recognized him from the video. Most didn't ask. And that suited him. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted systems to be better, not louder, just better. Some nights, he still read Thomas's last note. Folded and refolded until the corners frayed. It wasn't a message of closure. It was a reminder of continuity. Dignity is not handed down, it's built, again and again, by those who refuse to settle for less. And maybe that's why this story stayed, not because a boy was wronged, but because he answered with precision, not fury, with truth, not noise, because when no one else stood up, he stayed seated. In row 38B, if this story moved you, ask yourself, would you have stood up or looked away? Comment your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow Heart Story, where quiet stories still speak the loudest.